Hello, everyone. NCURA, the National Council of University Research Administrators, is pleased to welcome you to our webinar entitled ORCID, Connecting the Research Community. My name is Mark Schiffman, and I'm the Managing Editor for NCURA. Today's webinar is being produced by NCURA's Global Initiatives, which keeps research administrators and the research community connected throughout the world. Global initiatives include global webinars, global workshops, global fellowship programs, and resources for international collaboration. For more information about our global initiatives and the resources available, please visit our website under Global Initiatives. This webinar is being recorded and will last 90 minutes. The recording and slides will be available on NCURA's Global Webinars webpage in a few days. We will have 30 minutes for Q&A after all three presentations. Please type your questions in the chat box questions section at any time during the webinar, and our staff will collect your questions to share with the speakers at the end of the program as time allows. For those questions we're not able to answer, we will share the responses from the presenters when we share the recording. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Shauna Sadler is the Engagement Manager for the Americas at ORCID, and she's based in Calgary, Canada. Sheila Rayburn is the ORCID US Community Specialist at LYRIS, based in Eugene, Oregon. And Lorianne Schultz is the Senior Director of Research, Innovation, and Impact at the University of Arizona. Welcome, ladies. We understand this is a challenging time worldwide, so I'd like to thank all three of you for your dedication and commitment to the research administration community and for helping us keep the community informed. We'll start with Shauna's presentation, followed by Sheila, and then Lori. So let's get started. Shauna, thanks for being with us.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. The presenters, we're going to turn our cameras off now so that everyone can focus on the slides. Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. So the agenda today, first I'm going to talk about ORCID and give a high-level overview of the services we provide to researchers and research organizations. Then Sheila Rabin's going to speak about the US ORCID community, followed by an overview of ORCID's research impacts and global connections. And then Lorianne Schultz will talk about ORCID for research administrators, and then, as Mark said, we'll have time at the end for questions. Okay, great. Next slide, please. So ORCID's vision is a world where all who participate in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected to their contributions and affiliations across time, disciplines, and borders. So in short, ORCID is part of an infrastructure to organize scholarly activities. We provide a unique ID to people. This ID then connects the researcher's scholarly activities to their ORCID record. The person can be anywhere in the world and working in any discipline. So some background on ORCID for context. Back in 2009, ORCID was first announced as a collaborative effort by the research community to resolve the author name ambiguity problem in scholarly communications. ORCID was developed as a nonprofit organization that cannot be purchased or managed by a commercial organization. And ORCID started delivering services in 2012. ORCID provides three services. First, we issue unique ID numbers to people, usually researchers. Second, we provide a record with each unique ID number so people can document their research activities. Third, ORCID provides an infrastructure to share this data with other systems in the scholarly communications ecosystem. So while ORCID is free for individuals to use, as a global nonprofit organization, ORCID is sustained by membership structure for organizations interested in using the ORCID registry. Okay, so ORCID for researchers. Let's take a look at how ORCID works for researchers. So to demonstrate how ORCID works for researchers, we have Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia here to demonstrate. So please imagine Sofia is a researcher at your organization. Sofia went to our website, orcid.org, clicked on register, and spent approximately 2 minutes registering for her ORCID ID. So this is the 16-digit number that you see on the screen ending in 2427. Now this number is unique to Sofia. So when Sofia signed up for an ORCID ID, she was automatically assigned a record to capture her research activities. So I'd like to point out a few key sections of this record. So first, on the left-hand side, we provide the researcher the opportunity to share information about themselves and how they relate to the research community. On the right-hand side, the researcher can list information about themselves, such as their biography, current and past employers, and where they received their education. And as you scroll down the record, there's also space to capture professional memberships, funding that the researchers received, and a new section we call research resources, which are usually assets owned by a research organization, which the researcher applies to use and is awarded time with this asset. So an example may be a specialized telescope, a supercomputer, or a rare book collection. The work section is usually the most populated section of the record. This is where researchers list their scholarly output, such as journal articles, book chapters, and we support listing all forms of scholarly output. So we've created this short animation to explain the benefits of ORCID to an individual researcher. We're not going to play it now, but I do suggest watching it as a follow-up activity to this presentation and sharing it with your colleagues. So we've talked about ORCID for individual researchers. Now we're going to shift and talk about ORCID for organizations. There are three key groups when we think about the benefit of ORCID for research organizations. So first is the researcher with an ORCID ID and record full of their scholarly activities. Second is the ORCID registry. This is ORCID's infrastructure that holds the ORCID IDs and records. Currently, we hold just over 8.3 million of these records. Oh, no, can you go back? So in the middle column, ORCID holds 8.3 million of these records from scholars around the world and in every discipline. And on the right, the third column is your organization, and whichever platform you use to organize this information about your researchers' activities, such as funding awards, publications, etc. These systems are sometimes called CRIS systems. They're also known as ERA systems. Okay, next slide, please. So ORCID has built an infrastructure where the data about these 8.3 million researchers can be shared with other organizational systems. When an organization gets membership with ORCID, the organization can pull data from ORCID to populate their system. So this can be done on demand or set up to enable auto update, giving administration access to real-time accurate data. You'll notice that the arrows go both ways in this diagram. With membership, organizations like yours can write to the researcher's records. This helps the researcher to maintain accurate data in their ORCID record, which is used to populate forms such as funding applications and manuscript submissions with publishers. Next slide, please. So here's a list of some of the vendors that ORCID has worked with to enable the transfer of data between the ORCID registry and organizations like yours. One important note is that we work with many members and their custom platforms to integrate data transfers into unique local homegrown systems as well. So stepping back and looking at ORCID's role in the research ecosystem, we see the researcher at the center of it all, with interdependent relationships with funding agencies, publishers, and their employer. ORCID provides a unique identifier for the researcher so they can be clearly identified and given credit for their research activities. And again, you'll notice the two-way arrows representing data flowing between ORCID registry and other stakeholder systems such as funding agencies and publishers. Automating the data to flow freely from the source of the data to stakeholders allows for accurate data to populate our systems and minimize burden on researchers or research administrators. The ORCID registry is a hub that enables research data to flow efficiently. So in reality, this is what it looks like. So as of April 1st, over 53 million works have been written to 8.3 million researcher ORCID records in our registry. 47 million of those works have a DOI or a digital object identifier. 37 million of these works were written from member organizations using the ORCID API. So here's a list of some of our members who are writing data to ORCID records, publishers like Elsevier, government organizations like NASA, and universities like NYU. So Ankura asked us to speak about the ORBIT project. This project brought together stakeholders in the research funding infrastructure environment to discuss how to best embrace personal identifiers to enable efficiencies in the research funding workflow, with the goal to enable transparency and reliability of research information. The ORBIT Funder Working Group made 3 recommendations. So funders, publishers, and identifier registries like ORCID should work together to develop, implement, and socialize workflows that use identifiers. Second, funder reporting systems should implement digital reporting workflows that reduce reporting burden. And third, funders should partner with publishers to leverage identifiers to enable compliance with funder open access and data sharing requirements. So coming out of the ORBIT project, we have an ever-increasing number of funding agencies joining ORCID with membership and starting to write to the ORCID registry. And here are a few statistics to show the activities of our newest community. So internationally, as I mentioned, ORCID has issued unique IDs to just over 8.3 million researchers. We currently have 1,150 organizational members around the world and growing every day. And there are 24 ORCID consortia around the world, 2 of which are in the US. Next slide, please. First is the ORCID US Community, hosted by Lyrasis, which is ORCID's largest consortium that is mostly comprised of universities, but a growing number of nonprofits. Second is our newest consortia, the ORCID Consortium, hosted by the US Department of Energy, run by staff in the Office of Science Technical Information. The consortium accepts members from the DOE and other US federal government agencies. All right, well, I'll turn it over to Sheila now, and I'll be available for questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shauna. So as Shauna mentioned, in the US, we do have a national ORCID consortium for nonprofit, non-government organizations called the ORCID US Community. And I am the ORCID US Community Specialist, so I'm representing this group. Lyrasis is the administrative home for the ORCID US Community, and for those who might not be familiar, Lyrasis is a US-based membership organization that provides services primarily for libraries, archives, and museums, and also kind of extending more into the broader research and scholarly communication landscape. So on the next slide, you'll see that we formed this consortium in 2018 as a partnership with the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Northeast Research Libraries, and the Greater Western Library Alliance. And we're now also partnering with the Health Research Alliance, which is a group of nonprofit health research funders. So the consortium basically provides a significantly reduced annual membership fee for organizations, which is currently $4,300 per calendar year, as well as a means to create a community of practice around ORCID in the US and have open communication for all of the different research organizations that are working with ORCID across the country. Again, just to reiterate, it is free for individual researchers to use their ORCID ID, but organizations that want to benefit from using ORCID in research and scholarly communication workflows can become ORCID members. However, your organization does not have to be an ORCID member in order to encourage your researchers to use ORCID. The membership is really for the organizations that want to be able to leverage the benefits of ORCID in their workflows. And I'll talk about those benefits more in just a minute. But on the next slide, we have just a visual map showing where all of our current members are. Right now, we have 132 member organizations as part of our ORCID US Community Consortium. And these are mostly universities, but we also have some research institutes and health and hospital systems that are not affiliated with universities. And we also have some nonprofit health research funders as well. So on the next slide, you've heard me talk about libraries. We're partnering with other library groups. University libraries have typically been the leaders so far in the ORCID US community, but we're seeing more growth and awareness and involvement amongst both researchers and staff at various institutions. So at research institutions like universities, we've found that the more internal stakeholder units like the library, the research office, sponsored programs, central IT, and various academic units, the more these different groups can work together to strategize for local ORCID adoption, the more your institution and affiliated researchers can all benefit. And if you're coming from a different type of institution, not a university, you might still think about what other departments or units at your organization might be interested in conversations about ORCID. When it comes to ORCID adoption, The hard sciences and the health and medical sciences have been the areas of study most likely to be familiar with ORCID so far. And that's primarily because the journals that these researchers are publishing in and those journals often are requiring ORCID IDs, and increasingly we're also seeing more STEM-related research funders asking for or requiring ORCID IDs in their workflows. But ORCID can be used by researchers and contributors across all disciplines, including humanities, social sciences, arts. Really, any kind of output can be documented in an ORCID record. It doesn't just have to be journal articles. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a sample of adding a work to an ORCID record. It can be a publication, it can be a conference presentation, but there's also a section for other types of works. And you'll notice here that, artistic performance is one of the options. So really, ORCID can be used across all disciplines. Awareness is spreading across the disciplines. As a recent example of this, law scholars are becoming more aware of ORCID since there are plans to use ORCID data to contribute to a new scholarly impact ranking for US law schools, for example. Basically, no matter what discipline or field of research you're involved in, ORCID can help to distinguish researchers from each other, enable recognition of both individuals and the organizations they're affiliated with, and ultimately the ORCID record can be used as a central hub where both individual researchers and the organizations they're affiliated with can keep track of those affiliations, activities, and contributions, despite any changes in name or location or area of study. So ORCID, again, is a central hub for keeping a record of this information and then streamlining it across systems and organizations. I like to think of ORCID as kind of it's not a CV, but you can think about ORCID as kind of a next generation CV or resume, but rather than keeping track of activities and accomplishments in a static Word document, ORCID allows that data to be transferred between systems, so it's interoperable. And as a researcher, the organizations that you're affiliated with can write information to your ORCID record for you. So this kind of leads into our next slide, which goes into some of the benefits of ORCID for research institutions. The organizations that are involved in the ORCID US Community Consortium, they're ORCID members because they see the value of ORCID within the following 4 main benefits. So the first one is the ability to accurately identify and distinguish between individuals to mitigate any confusion that might be caused by name ambiguity. So on the next slide, for example, if someone has used different names or different name formations over the years, or let's say you have multiple people with the same name or the same initials, it can be really tricky to distinguish and know who's who or whether several different names are referring to one person. So going to our example of Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, and then these names over on the other side of the screen, these could all be the same person or they could be different people. But when we're looking at the name alone, we have no way of knowing who these names are referring to and if it's the same person. So that's why on the next slide, that ORCID ID, that ORCID identifier number, comes into play to provide a way to distinguish between people despite what their name is. And if their name changes, or if they have any other changes over the course of their career, the ORCID ID number will stay the same. So that way, as a research administrator, you don't have to spend time solving any mysteries about who's who when it comes to names. You can rely on that ORCID ID to uniquely identify various individuals that you're working with. So if we go to the next slide, another benefit of ORCID is a streamlined approach for gathering data about researchers and their activities for reporting and assessment purposes, looking at both individual contributions and group activities and impact. So with the next slide, as Shauna mentioned earlier in the presentation, ORCID does provide that central secure place where this data can be stored, and then data from within your researcher's ORCID records can be read or transferred from those ORCID records to your local systems at your institution, which makes the data collection process easier. On the next slide, ORCID also allows organizations to benefit by asserting authoritative information onto your affiliated researchers' ORCID records. So this is kind of the opposite of what we just saw on the next slide. In other words, ORCID allows the ability to also write data to your researchers' ORCID records. And this helps to really confirm which researchers are indeed affiliated with your institution. And it can help to provide more accurate information about researchers' activities and contributions that will then be read by other organizations in the research ecosystem. So publishers, funders, other research institutions, they are also reading data from ORCID records and writing data to ORCID records. So we're all working together to contribute to a trustworthy, centralized place that can allow data to flow between all of our different systems. And so on the next slide, really all of this is designed to save time and reduce administrative burden, both for researchers and research administrators and staff, to really help make life easier for everyone. So on the next slide, an example of this is current research information systems, like you may have heard of Faculty 180, Pure, Digital Measures, Symplectic Elements. These are just a few examples from the list that Shauna showed earlier of systems that are integrated with ORCID and allow researchers to, for example, import data directly from their ORCID record into these systems, rather than having to retype all of their information into various systems over and over again. So essentially, as long as researchers have their ORCID record populated with data, they can leverage these connections with ORCID-enabled systems, both inside and outside of their own institutions. Some of these systems, like Pure and Symplectic Elements, also allow data to be pushed from the system to ORCID to help researchers populate their ORCID record with data that can then be sent to other systems, like Science CV, for example. So on the next slide, many of you have probably been hearing a lot about Science CV lately. So Science CV is a biosketch tool that both the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the National Science Foundation, NSF, those agencies have researchers use this tool called Science CV when they're applying for grant funding. And Science CV is one of the systems that is configured to work with ORCID as well. So basically, researchers can actually connect their ORCID ID with their Science CV account and then populate their information by transferring data directly from their ORCID record to Science CV. So with the new requirements around NSF biosketches, for example, researchers can save a lot of time and hassle by just making sure all of their data is filled out in their ORCID record, so they can transfer their data to Science CV by clicking a button, rather than having to fill out forms and re-enter their data in multiple systems. And these are just a few examples. There are a growing number of systems that are integrating with ORCID and allowing for this type of information and data transfer to help everyone save time and really reduce that administrative burden. So on the next slide, as you know, ORCID is used around the globe. So we have a few examples of universities and other research institutes that have integrated with ORCID into their systems. Studies have been done in the UK, Portugal, and Australia, for example, showing the amount of time saved on staff time as well as researcher time with reporting and grant applications by using ORCID to transfer data. So you can see here that in the UK, a portion of staff time has been saved per institution. And in Portugal and Australia, we're looking at researcher hours and researcher time saved in various research-related workflows like grant applications by being able to use ORCID to transfer data instead of having to fill out multiple forms and take all that time to re-enter information into multiple systems. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about some of the current trends that we have seen around ORCID include implications for looking at research impact and making global connections. A very, very recent report that just came out from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they recently released a report on the topic of charting the digital transformation of science. And the report shared some insight based on a survey from 2018 that was conducted with 12,000 authors working in a variety of disciplines across 60 countries. And so among some other points, they concluded that a persistent, trusted identity can play a role in the way that researchers and their output are evaluated, which is increasingly important as we look to speed up research and information sharing to support global challenges like what we're seeing around COVID-19 right now. When research is shared, we often look at who the authors are, of course, and who was involved in the research to determine the trustworthiness of that information. I mean, Google is one way to look somebody up by typing in a name. But again, if a researcher has a common name or if their name has changed over the course of the years, it can be hard to determine who did what and who is affiliated with what institution. So the ORCID ID provides that trusted, persistent way to identify researchers. And note also that when it comes to information sharing and privacy, with ORCID, the researcher is in full control over how their identity is created, connected, and shared. The survey also found that ORCID ID is now the most widely used identification mechanism for researchers to assert online identity, more so even than any national identifiers or author identifiers that are connected to specific publishers or specific systems. And that's another great thing about ORCID is that it's not tied to any one system. It can be used across multiple systems. And ORCID is now embedded in the global research ecosystem. The report found that researchers that are using digital tools and digital identity more extensively tend to leverage tools like project management and cloud services more and engage in more activities that can result in broader impact mechanisms, things like patents, business management activity, provision of research services, and consultancy work. So essentially, the stronger the digital identity, the more research-related engagement somebody is likely to have. So on the next slide, you can imagine that with over 8 million researchers all over the world, and that number is steadily growing, with over 8 million researchers using ORCID to keep a record of their affiliations and contributions, that makes it much easier to look at all of that data in ORCID and make connections and look at trends. So what you're seeing here on the left side of the screen is from Science Magazine, where they looked at location data within ORCID and then used that to map out how scientists are migrating around different parts of the world. And if you go to this article online, this graphic is actually interactive, so you can click around and move around to see different migration trends. And then on the right side of the screen, this is a data visualization exercise that our colleagues in Australia at the Australian Access Federation did using ORCID data to map out where faculty at Australian institutions are collaborating with researchers in other parts of the world. So you're seeing these color-coded lines coming out from a central point, which is Australia, And this is all based on ORCID data, and the colors correspond with different institutions in Australia, so they can get a visual of where all of their faculty in Australia are collaborating with others around the world. And these are just a few examples of the types of analysis that can be done with ORCID data. On the next slide, in terms of open data and open research, ORCID contributes to sharing and finding collaborators, because instead of having researcher information and contributions spread out all over the web, ORCID provides that central, publicly available place for everyone to store and access this data, and to make sure that individuals are linked to their contributions. This makes research, publications, data sets, and other research artifacts and information about researchers more findable. So researchers can connect with each other, make their deliverables and contributions more findable, allowing for more awareness and collaboration across the research landscape. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a screenshot from an article that came out around the first image that was taken of a black hole. And you'll see here the green ID icon next to almost all of the author names. And there are actually hundreds of authors on this paper. But if you go to this actual site and click on the ID icon for each person, it will take you to their ORCID record. So this is a easy way to be able to find out more about all of these different people, rather than just seeing their names. You're not really, when you're just seeing the name, you don't really know who these people are or where they're coming from. If you click on the ORCID ID icon, you're taken to their ORCID record, where you can find out more details about these people and what they're studying. So it just brings more visibility to the individuals, their affiliations, their contributions, and how they might partner and work and collaborate together. Next slide, please. In terms of helping researchers get credit and recognition for their work, in addition to the ORCID ID itself, I'm going to talk about an example of another tool that was built based on ORCID called rescognito.com. And it's based on ORCID IDs and ORCID data. So essentially, anyone with an ORCID ID can recognize anyone else who also has an ORCID ID for various types of contributions related to good research citizenship, including things like contribution to open research, sharing negative results, mentoring, and positive public impact. Those are just a few examples. There are a lot of different ways that people can be recognized on this platform. And what you're seeing on the screen is an example of a Rescognito ledger for a colleague of mine, Richard Wynn, where you can see his ORCID ID is linked. And I have recognized him for contributions to public outreach and education. And you can also see that other individuals have recognized him, other peers, and an organization, Pitapalooza Conference, has also recognized him. So organizations that participate can also recognize contributions and activities of individuals as well. So on the next slide, there's also a visualization element in this tool where you can see all of the people and organizations that have recognized Richard in this graph. And on the actual website, this is interactive as well, including myself. So on the next slide, for example, if we were to hover over my name on this graph, I can see where Richard and I have shared connections. So Rescognito is a new tool that just came out last year, and we're expecting to see development of more of these types of tools that are designed to use ORCID IDs and data from ORCID records to help researchers make connections, connect to others, and get recognition for their work. And I think we've come to the end of my portion, so I will pass it over to Lori at this point.
Great, thank you, Sheila. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and someone can send me a chat if you can't. So what I want to talk about on my next slide is really why a research administrator should be informed and care about ORCID. So, I mean, you already know the answer to this question about why you should be informed. It's because you're the person that the faculty member is going to ask about how this impacts them, how does it work, what do I need to do next? And that's because we as research administrators are often utility players across many types of activity that involve our faculty. Our roles are often as generalists, not specialists, and we become trusted to a point that those questions come to us whether they are directly related to our job duties or not, because we figure out how to get the answer, whether that's coming from us or from someone else. And we do our best to provide solutions for faculty across a whole number of activities, including putting the pieces together of proposal development, working in our departments or our central sponsored projects to get applications together and submitted, and helping them comply with policies like public access policies. Throughout our careers as research administrators, we work across different scholarly disciplines. So the faculty member you work today may be in one discipline, and the one you work with next year is going to be in a different one. Because of that, we have to pivot to learn about different sponsors and stakeholders and how those priorities shift across different disciplines. But the tools we use have to cross those boundaries, and they need to work for our faculty, whether our faculty are in fine arts, humanities, biomedical research, or astronomy. So for the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit about how ORCID can help with that. So you've learned today from Sheila and Shauna what ORCID is and how it works. Just as an aside for myself, I use it very regularly to keep track of my own presentations and publications, because it's a very easy way for me to have one place to look at all of that information. And as you already know from today, ORCID IDs are unique identifiers for researchers. So how easy is it, all the systems where data lives about one person, how easy is it to get that data in one place? And I say that that's a trick question because the answer is that it's not easy. The pieces of an individual researcher's profile live in many places, whether you're talking about your own institutional systems for ERA, employment information, profile information for like promotion and tenure, for instance, or frankly, the dozens of files that are stored on an individual's hard drive, whether those be PDF files or Word files. What ORCID can do to bring that information together is act like a primary key for the person. So that number follows them throughout their career, through the things that may change, like their employment, where they are, and even what their name is, and the way that they use their name on publications and proposal applications. So that allows us to associate works with a person throughout their career. And they give us a way to find that data so it can be used for a number of questions that you might be asked, including data that answers questions around big institutional questions. Like, let's say your institution made an investment for a certain discipline, like you really want to be great at space. Well, what are some of the ways that you might decide are going to be the answers to say that, yes, you are great at space? You might be looking at publication output, presentations by the faculty members involved, other things like book chapters, editorships, grants, and ORCID can help figure out where all those things are so that we can answer that question. And it also helps us figure out other strategic planning type questions. We are often asked at universities and research institutions to talk about what we're good at. And that's a really interesting question from my perspective, because we usually think we know what the answer to that question is. We usually think that we could point to our expertise in a certain field, but that doesn't answer the question to what the data says. And ORCID can help us build those kinds of tools to understand around rubrics for return on investment or scholarly output. What are the things that we are known for that maybe our own internal data doesn't tell us? We can also track activities and outputs for research on a number of fronts, like promotion and tenure. If you're a state institution like mine, it might be that you figure out a way to use that data to talk to stakeholders about impact. With a state institution, that might be talking to your local politicians and your state legislator. And then, coming up on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about sponsored projects and burden and how we use that data over and over again for many purposes. One of those things is really proposal applications and what the future can look like. In our institutional profile systems, in our ERA systems, whether you have a homegrown solution or a vended solution, there is a lot of information about a single faculty member that lives in these disparate places I talked about earlier. So ORCID can help us simplify the process and of applying for and managing grants by basically going back to the example that both Sheila and Shauna talked about earlier, which is that researchers share their ID when they interact with a sponsor, a publisher, our own systems at our universities like profile systems or employee records, which then in turn can go feed back into ORCID with that information that they can choose to share. So that can help us, like the broad future could mean that they could share that to create a proposal application to any number of sponsors who can adopt that API so that you as a departmental research administrator or a central research administrator or your faculty member are not reinventing the wheel by typing in the data that already exists over and over and over again. So it's a really powerful tool, and there are a bunch of different ways to think about what it could look like. And so can I go get my next slides, please? And with that, I want to talk about what it does look like today for a certain number of sponsors, both federal and non-federal. So for the National Institutes of Health, many of you may already know that researchers can link their ORCID ID to the personal profile in ERA Commons. And the ORCID is required for a certain part of the population of NIH individual applicants. So for training grants, they started requiring an ORCID for appointees in X-Train as of October of last year. And for applicants for training grants, fellowships, and career development awards, that requirement went into effect this past January. They're definitely encouraged for all other investigators. I think this is one of those things where if you're looking out to what the future could look like, these requirements that already exist help enable additional functionality over time, including application completion and reporting requirements. So getting started now means you're ready when the requirement comes down. I think that, I can't speak for a federal agency, of course, but I think I can make a pretty safe bet on how this will look in a couple of years for all kinds of investigator types, not just the ones we talked about today. In ScienceCV, you can generate the NIH BioSketch. So ScienceCV, we've talked about it already today. ScienceCV stands for the Science Experts Network and Curriculum Vitae. And that's a joint project between the Federal Demonstration Partnership, the NIH, and the NSF to lessen faculty burden in the application process. And the real first start of that was the NIH BioSketch format. And I will talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But we'll go ahead and move on to NSF. So again, just like NIH, we can go back to the last slide. Still on that one. Just like NIH, researchers can link their ORCID ID in the research.gov profile. As many of you are very aware, the newest PAP guide requires that the BioSketch and current and pending support forms must be provided in an NIH-approved format as of the June 1 application deadline. And ScienceCV is one of the approved formats for both of those forms. When linked with the ORCID ID, ScienceCV can create those forms with minimal data entry, and multiple versions can be saved and edited. So, like the example of having multiple Word files on a hard drive, this is a way of being able to tailor the BioSketch and the current and pending support and make appropriate changes, because you're not using the same form over and over again. You know that things like what awards and publications are applicable to one application may not have been applicable to the last one. So you do have that ability to make multiple ones and pick and choose the version you want to submit with the application that's sitting on your desk today. And I want to talk a little bit, we've spent a lot of time talking about the NIH and NSF in terms of ORCID and ScienceCV, but I want to tell you a little bit also about what the future already looks like with non-federal sponsors and the use of ORCID. So many of you are already familiar with Proposal Central, which is an online platform that handles proposal applications for a number of nonprofit funders, including ones like the American Lung Association, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the American Cancer Society, and that's just a handful. There are many more nonprofit funders that use that platform to post their funding opportunities and to receive applications under their funding opportunities. Proposal Central is a place where you can see what this integration power of it is with ORCID. So with Proposal Central, the integration is considerable, including logging in using your ORCID credentials, which means no setting up a new profile and a new username and password. You can create your profile with ORCID information, basically allow Proposal Central to bring that in so that Proposal Central knows who you are because of your ORCID profile that already exists, and allows you to start your application with that information. So this is one of those things where I would encourage you to look forward as to how this could change the landscape of how you prepare and submit proposals today to a number of different sponsors, not just the nonprofit ones that are using Proposal Central, but even more. And what do we need to do to get there? The last thing I'll say about access policies and reducing burden is that you've already heard from Sheila and Shauna that ORCID is commonly required by publishers and funders. Your library is a valuable resource in helping faculty comply with these kinds of policies, both for public access and for data management. And they can help you start off by publishing in compliant journals. One of the things that many of you are probably already aware of is back in 2012, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a memo indicating that these sponsors, our U.S. federal agencies, needed to develop plans to make publications that result from that funding publicly available. And ORCID is really organic to this process. ORCID is part of that solution since it brings in those publications from publishers, and it can help your librarians assist faculty in publishing in compliant journals and pulling that information all together to make sure that they are complying with these policies. And part of the reason this is so helpful is that when we talk about U.S. federal agencies, we're talking about, of course, biomedical, non-biomedical, but many of them, including non-federal agencies, are making use of the NIH tools that already exist for this, even though they may not be a biomedical funding organization. So just as a couple of examples, the American Heart Association, NASA, NIST, all use the NIH manuscript submission system and PubMed, and ORCID is a way that we can pull all these things together. So it really isn't just for the NIH anymore. And on my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about reducing burden and how ORCID can help with some of that. ORCID really helps by leveraging data that already exists. And I think that if there's any one message from today, that is the message. It's using the information you already have to do more. I referenced the Federal Demonstration Partnership a little bit earlier, and so I'll explain a little bit what that is if your institution is not a member or this is the first time you're hearing about it. So the FDP is an organization of federal agencies and university and research organization members whose primary goal is to reduce burden in grant administration while maintaining stewardship of federal funds. And so that's just sort of like the mission of why the FDP exists. And the FDP has worked with an organization called the Research Business Models Working Group for a number of years on things like Science CV. But I'll back up a little bit and talk about the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act of 2017, which directed the Office of Management and Budget to establish an interagency working group to reduce administrative burden on federally funded researchers. Many of you will be aware that there have been 3 faculty burden surveys conducted via the Federal Demonstration Partnership that really reflect how much time researchers are spending on things other than research when it comes to their federally funded grants. So the AICA wanted to come in and say, how do we effectively reduce burden? What are some of the things that we can do to make that happen under federally funded awards? So they established this interagency working group, which is the Research Business Models Working Group, or the RBMG. And that basically, and I've included some links on the slide that you'll get. So aside from the interagency working group, the ACA requires a couple of things that are super relevant to this conversation. One is the establishment of a centralized researcher profile database, and the other is simplified uniform grant application format and processes. And ORCID, as I hope you are already coming to understand, can leverage the data that already exists to do those things. We can see it with Proposal Central, we can see it with profile information, and we can see it with Science CV. So the Research Business Models Working Group has been working with the FDP since before the Act on burden, specifically with ScienceCV. ScienceCV started as a proof of concept for all the things that we're already talking about, bringing in data that already exists to satisfy a need. The first iteration of ScienceCV was generating that NIH BioSketch to basically prove that we could do it, to prove that the technology was mature enough to bring in the information that pulls together the data needed to fill out a BioSketch. The report of the Research Business Models Working Group recommends using these existing workflows, so things that already exist, like ScienceCV, like linkages with ORCID, to get to that place where we get to a centralized researcher profile database. And going further, having this information makes the case for building an application process that draws from this information instead of multiple iterations of the SF424 R&R over and over and over again. And our role as research administrators is to socialize the use of ORCID in our institutions to help that adoption and give ourselves an opportunity to have influence and figure out how we can use it to suit our own purposes, both in assisting faculty and also in assisting our institution. And with that, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at the University of Arizona on my next slide. So I talked a little bit about the history of ScienceCV, and the history of ScienceCV comes from universities. As I mentioned before, the FDP is made up of university members and federal agency members. So universities were the ones who informed how ScienceCV was going to work, and that group includes a membership of faculty that basically come in and tell us their realities and what that looks like and what kind of needs they have to make this work for them. So the U of A, the University of Arizona has a system that we're branded UAVT. Sheila mentioned Faculty 180, and that's what it is. And it's our online system for annual faculty reviews. And so we integrate with ORCID to enable seamless syncing of data between the two systems back and forth. So that sort of multi-directional arrow that both Sheila and Shauna referred to earlier. It makes our research more discoverable, but we definitely need to do more to socialize this on our campus and make it work for a broader number of people. I mean, the last time we looked to see how many people with a U of A domain, so arizona.edu in ORCID, it was well over 3,000 people. It's probably more today. And what we need to do is to do the work to get those people, to ensure it's connected with the University of Arizona, and get more people to sign up for ORCID, and we need to be able to help them do that. One of the areas where I feel the U of A is really strong is in our collaboration with our research office and libraries on helping faculty comply with public access policies, with open access questions and data repositories, including things like data management plans and the NIH data management policies across the spectrum of data that might come out of an NIH grant. So we work together very regularly in assisting faculty there, and work together on joint comments and responses to federal requests for information on all of these things. It's a powerful collaboration, and speaking for myself, I love libraries. I should have been a librarian, and working with them is one of the best parts of my job. One of the other things, as COVID-19 hit, we were right on the verge of doing a whole lot more with ORCID, and now, as I'm sure is true for many of you, our lives have changed in many more ways than whether or not we wear a mask to the grocery store. Right now, we're probably managing work from home, with school work from home for our kids, with how to navigate our worlds coming together and still being able to sleep at night. So there are a lot of things about our day-to-day that have changed a lot. And for us at the University of Arizona, we were really working on a few ideas of what we wanted to do, and then I know we'll get to once life gets to a place where we can sort of consume all these changes and it becomes a little more like, normal's probably the wrong word, but you see what I'm getting at. One of the things that we were really talking about doing is figuring out how to include ORCID presence and assistance in all of our events. Many of you, like us, probably have, training events of all kinds, in person and otherwise, or other marketing events where you have a table or a booth where you're talking about the different services you provide. And so we were talking about what ways could we do that? Could we have someone to staff a U of A ORCID table to get people signed up, to get them to connect with the University of Arizona with their ORCID ID? And I believe we'll still proceed with that, and we'll just have to figure out a way to do it in a more virtual environment. We also, with the research office, which I represent, are working with the libraries on what kind of other applications could we build that use ORCID data, like building out our own profile systems so that our research is discoverable not just to other people on campus who may not know who they can work with, but also industry partners who might be really interested in what the U of A has to offer in certain fields. We are working on something called a knowledge map where we can answer that question of what is it we do well at the U of A in terms of major topics and who's working together on our campus. And there are a lot of things that we can do to integrate ORCID to make that more effective for us as we build out that application. Just in talking with Sheila and Shauna this week as we were putting this presentation together, I definitely came up with other ideas for things we can do next that might also be useful to you, which is, so Res Cognito seems like a really great way for us to integrate with our knowledge map and with our own internal systems, because sometimes, you know, understanding how our colleagues and our faculty are recognized and respected by their peers is a really powerful way to say who we are in this world, in any discipline, in university research. And I'm particularly interested in the resources idea that Shauna mentioned at the beginning about that idea of assigning how that people could show that they had time on a specialized piece of equipment, or maybe telescope time or something like that. And I want to investigate, as soon as my time frees up a little bit, how could we use that for our core facilities and our specialized equipment, and how people can recognize that they're able to use highly specialized equipment that there may not be very many in our state or even in our country. So there are a lot of really interesting questions we think we can answer, or at least explore through ORCID. And so as I wrap up, we'll go to our next slide and then we'll be ready for questions. So my real call to action for research administrators is, if you don't know your research librarians, meet them. They are a powerful tool in your toolkit for helping your faculty meet public access compliance policies, for getting into ORCID and understanding the power on that. There are a couple of NSF webinars, and my next slide has a link to those resources. If you're an FDP member institution, talk to me about how you can get involved on Science CV and ORCID. It's a topic I've been working on for well over 10 years now, and I can help you get involved. The other thing is, learn about ORCID at your institution and encourage your faculty to connect and grant access, and figure out how you can help there. Many of you may not even be aware if your school is a member, but you can find out easily. And the last thing is to work with your ERA vendors, or I would even say your IT staff, if you have a homegrown ERA solution, on how you can add ORCID as a field to take advantage of the kinds of APIs and the kind of integration of systems that we've been talking about today. So as my next slide is the list of resources, which of course you will get when these slides are distributed. As I mentioned, so the Science CV link includes video tutorials on how to link ORCID, how the BioSketch process works. For NSF, there is a recording of a webinar from earlier this month that talks about how it works with the NSF BioSketch and the current pending support forms. And you can also register for their next webinar, which is on May 14th, which will talk more about this stuff in advance of the June 1 deadline. I've also included the link to the requirement for NIH use of ORCIDs for trainees, fellows, and career awards, and then a couple of links to universities who are doing things that I know about around ORCID, including my own. I include North Carolina State mostly because they are a great example of best practice on getting your faculty engaged and how the libraries and research can work together to assist faculty to get that started. And with that said, we'll go ahead and move to questions. I know we got a few questions in advance of this, so I will go ahead and start with one of the first questions. And thank you again to Shauna and Sheila for the overview. So our first question is, what are the advantages to registering on ORCID as opposed to Science CV? Can you discuss the differences between the two products? Is one more widely preferred by federal sponsors, and which is easier to use? So multiple questions.
I think I'll leave it to Sheila and yourself, Lori, to answer that one.
Great, thank you, Shauna.
Okay.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think we covered some of that in the presentation, but basically, ORCID is used across the globe by multiple individuals and organizations, whereas Science CV is only used by the U.S. federal agencies we discussed, like NIH and NSF. So ORCID is the central hub for storing and transferring all types of data about individual researchers and affiliations and contributions, whereas Science CV is only used to create a researcher bio sketch with specific information that's needed for a grant proposal. So they are definitely two separate things. ORCID is definitely more widely used across the globe. Science CV is only used for the federal agencies that use it for their grant proposal process. And as I mentioned, Science CV is integrated with ORCID. That means that data can be transferred from an ORCID record to Science CV, basically by clicking a button rather than having to retype that information. So researchers can save a lot of time by using ORCID as their central place to store all of that data. And then when the time comes to use Science CV, they can connect their ORCID ID with Science CV and bring and import that data in from ORCID. But again, ORCID is integrated with many, many different systems in addition to Science CV. So there's really a lot of value there in terms of having an ORCID record. Lori, if you want to add anything, or Shauna, feel free.
I think the only thing I'd add is that Science CV is the first step along the way in the process of that centralized researcher profile database I talked about as a requirement of the AICA. And I think that ORCID helps us get there. And so Science CV is that step along the way to show that we can pull the information together, and having something like an ORCID is what enables us to get there. So the next question I have is, what is required to delegate completion or maintenance of an ORCID profile? I read somewhere about a trusted individual, but I don't know if this capability is restricted to individuals affiliated with trusted member organization, or if that means something different. I know this is a popular question in the FDP.
Sheila, I know you answer this question a lot. I think you've got a really smooth answer. Do you want to take this
Sure,
one?
yeah,
Okay.
I can. Yeah, so anyone who has an ORCID ID can designate anyone else who also has an ORCID ID as a trusted individual, which means, so for example, if I were to go into my ORCID record, there's an account settings tab. On that account settings page, there's a trusted individual section where I can type in somebody's name, email address, or if I know their ORCID number, I can type that in, and then select the person to designate as a trusted individual for my account. The thing is, that person does have to have an ORCID ID. They don't have to be affiliated with a member organization, so that does not matter. They just have to have their own ORCID ID. So for example, I could designate Shauna as a trusted individual on my ORCID record, and so when Shauna goes to log into her ORCID record, she can actually see mine and have access to mine and make changes to my ORCID record for me. So it's a really helpful thing when you have really busy faculty who maybe aren't used to keeping track of all of their stuff themselves. Maybe they have an admin or research assistant. I know of many of our members in the libraries where faculty have designated a librarian as a trusted individual to help them get their data populated in ORCID. So that is a useful tool. And the only requirement is that both people have an ORCID ID.
Great, thank you. So then the next question I have is about the ORCID feature for importing publications. So for a full and clean citation record to appear in ORCID, they are using the PMID feature. However, you can only import one at a time. They're saying that BibTeX was their next choice, but that didn't work that well either, and they'd like to hear your thoughts on what they can try next.
Importing, that is tricky, and we are trying some new tools, and we're working with lots of different vendors. So I think if you're doing it on your own and using the import tools, the search and link wizards and the import tools right now is your best bet. We are continuing to work with those providers to make it more effective and make it more efficient, less clicks, and include more of the metadata. But if your institution does have memberships, Sheila and Lori mentioned some different platforms that you can use to get the data and then write it from those platforms. But that's more at an organizational level or departmental level, so more of an aggregate way of managing multiple records. So Sheila has a fantastic template for talking to vendors and encouraging them to improve the data that they provide, their integrations in their data, and that includes the individual importing their records. Sheila, would you add anything else to that?
Yeah, I would just add for the specific question around using PubMed ID, within the ORCID record, if you go to the Works section and click Add Works, you'll see that there's a number of different options for ways that you can add works. If you know the PubMed ID for your publication, that's one way of doing it. And of course, uploading a BibTeX file is also another way. PubMed, though, in particular, also does have a search and link wizard. So we basically, there are a number of databases that are already linked up with ORCID. And if you go to the work section and click on search and link wizards, you'll see all those. Europe PubMed Central is one of those databases. So basically, an individual researcher can go in, click search and link, click that Europe PubMed Central wizard, and it will search for their name or their ORCID ID. If they've submitted their ORCID ID with their publication, then it will show up, and they can basically claim their works to have those written to the ORCID record for them. So that's another way of adding works. And some other really good databases that are linked up through the search and link wizards are Crossref and DataCite, which are the two main organizations that mint DOIs for publications. And so that's kind of another easy way. But in general, the quality of the metadata that gets input onto the ORCID record is really dependent on the source of that metadata. So the search and link wizards are probably going to have more robust metadata than just adding a PubMed ID and importing that way. So I would encourage people to look at those search and link wizards, and if there are any issues with the metadata that gets imported from any of those search and link wizards, it's more on the side of those data providers. And of course, metadata issues are not specific to ORCID. We, across the board, everyone is, looking for ways to make sure that metadata is accurate and populates, into other systems correctly. So that would be my addition there.
Great, thank you. So the next question I will try to answer, and then Sheila or Shauna can tell me if I got any of it wrong. So can I, as a research administrator, look up a PI at my institution to find their ORCID IDs, similar to how I currently look up a Commons ID now? And so my response would be yes, but what you see depends on what they want you to see. So one of the things that's powerful about your ORCID profile is a faculty member can decide to make the information public, shared with that trusted individual like a delegate, or not open to anyone but themselves. So they can set that at multiple levels, including each of the different sections that we saw earlier, like their employment, their works, their memberships and service. Anything you'd like to add, Sheila or Shauna?
I'll just do a plug. We just improved our search interface on the ORCID website, and so hopefully it's a little easier for everybody to use, and you can do the search at the top right-hand corner, and then you can go to the advanced search, and so that'll maybe help you, because of course there's lots of people with similar or the same names, and it's nice to see that they're if you're familiar with which universities and that they've been affiliated with, or some of their keywords for their research topics, that they will display on the results, and that makes it a little bit more useful. We've been working hard on our search interface, so try to give it a plug. Sheila, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just chime in and build on what the other two have said, which is that you can go to orchid.org and search for somebody's name, but of course the search results are only going to be as good as the data that's populated within that record. So the faculty person you're looking for, they may have an ORCID ID, but they may not have any data or public data available in their ORCID record to help you, uniquely identify that that's the right person, because there may be other people with that same name. So the best practice for knowing exactly who at your institution has an ORCID ID and knowing which one belongs to whom is to work on building that ORCID API into your systems, having your faculty connect their ORCID ID with those systems. Then you know exactly who at your institution corresponds with which ORCID ID.
Great, thank you. So the next question is there a list of universities that are ORCID members, and where can I find it?
I guess yes. We have two answers. Yeah, that's right. So at orchid.org, you hover over membership. Let's see if I've got this memorized. We do list all of our members. I'm just going to do it right now. So you go to orchid.org and you hover over about, and then underneath that is
orchid.org/members.
/members. That's the other way. And then that'll show you all of our members. And then also you can do by the consortia. So you can list, the drop down is by country, so you can list your country, and then it could show you the members in that country as well. And then if you're wondering if your organization is a member of the Lyricist Consortium.
Yeah, so basically if you just go to that orchid.org/members, by default, it will show all the members alphabetically, and that's all the members across the globe. But you'll see there's an option to click on consortium members. And our consortium is called the Orchid US Community. So if you just go to the O's, because those are alphabetical, Orchid US Community, click on that, and you can see a whole list of our members.
Great, thank you. So the next question is to please clarify that if an institution is using Pure as an expert database, does ORCID feed into this system?
Yes. Yes, it does. And Pure enables the two-way data flow. So you can also pull data from the ORCID registry to populate Pure, and then in Pure, you can write to ORCID records. So it's most common for universities to write to the employment of researchers. So that way the university decides the exact name they want in the ORCID record. And then there's also organizational IDs that are partner colleagues who do that, who issue them. And then the consistent university ID is used when they write to those. So those are quite common. And we're also starting to hear from universities adding to their graduate students research, their ORCID records as well, the education, and then sometimes employment as well. So
great, thank you. So I think maybe this is a question for Shauna. Do you have any suggestions on how to promote the ORCID ID outside the U.S. at their institution? What is the biggest benefit to suggest to policymakers outside the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. So it depends on the practices of the research and reporting practices of your country. I know in Australia, they're very strict. They have very clear expectations for reporting. Other countries in Canada, they have their different practices. They're starting to coordinate a little bit more, but Australia is very centralized. So Australia is a heavy user of ORCID. They're very strong that way, whereas in Canada, the federal, the Tri-Council have not issued it. They're certainly aware and they're participating on our agency's working groups, the ORCID working groups, but they haven't made a policy on them yet, and that's okay. So I think with ORCID adoption at this point, it's really at the organizational level for your university or your research institute to best manage the data about your researchers. And it's not just, one is to be able to pull the data about your researchers to better manage internally. I know a lot of executives like to have the real-time accurate data and to be able to present that quickly so they can make decisions. But also sometimes you have to be able to demonstrate return on investment. So like we were talking about research resources before. If your university's invested in a major telescope, they'll ask for, what did we get from this investment? And so if you've done the research resources in ORCID, you can pull that data and say, these are all the publications or all the funding grants that have come from using that telescope. And so sometimes populating the ORCID record can help you with your own internal data and the assessment internally. And then also their adoption by publishers internationally has been tremendous. And so when your researchers are submitting manuscripts for publications in any form, there's often either an encouragement for an ORCID ID or it's mandatory. And so, so it's becoming more common practice with people who are publishing. And we're growing with those funders.
Great, thank you. So I think the answer to the next question is similar to the answer about Pure, and that's in discussing how ORCID integrates with digital measures. Looks like their university is moving towards digital measures as a required tool for faculty so that they can use it to develop reports, and they want to understand how they can leverage ORCID with digital measures.
Fantastic.
I can speak
Well,
about
thank you.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with digital measures, Pure, and all of these other vendor systems that have a degree of ORCID functionality built in, they may not each, they differ. Each vendor differs a little bit in what exactly they offer when it comes to ORCID. So digital measures is one that right now just allows importing publications from ORCID into digital measures. So just publications, none of the other data, and there's no writing from digital measures to ORCID right now. Whereas, as Shauna was speaking about Pure, right now you can import data from Pure into ORCID, but you can also write employment and works from Pure to ORCID. So, you know, regardless of what vendor system you're using, you'll want to look into those details. With something like digital measures, where they're only utilizing one little aspect of ORCID, that they could do more with it. For vendors, you really do have to contact your vendor, let them know that ORCID functionality, robust ORCID functionality is something that you do want to see, because they're looking to their customers to let them know what the customers want to see so they can prioritize that development. So for the ORCID US community, for example, we have email templates for all of these systems, so that if you're using one of these systems, you can just copy this email template and send it to them, and it already has everything in there asking them for what you want to see from ORCID. I'm happy for anyone to, you know, get in touch with me after this, I can share those resources with you. And one other note that I want to add about the vendor systems that have the ORCID functionality: your organization does need to be an ORCID member to get your API credential to turn on that functionality. So that's just one other thing to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, does ORCID interact with Pub EDU? And I'm not sure I know what that is.
Oh, I'm not familiar with it either. Sheila?
No.
We'll look into it and get back to you.
Yeah.
So the second part of this question was, what office within a university would be responsible for institutional membership? And I will start by saying that that's really up to your institution. Typically the libraries are coordinating the membership, but that does not have to be true.
Yeah, in fact, an emerging best practice has been to form some sort of committee or group that has people from different units, like the library, the research office, maybe central IT, maybe specific academic units, especially if you have a medical school or something like that. Having a committee that can all work together on it, and you can figure out and strategize how you're going to approach the membership, who's going to do what, and that way you can have more of a strategic approach across the organization. As it has unfolded so far, it just so happens that the libraries have been taking charge and leading this effort, but we're finding they're getting more benefits and a more strategic approach by working with other stakeholders across the organization.
Thank you. So the next question, is there a way to minimize burden of entering publications that are not yet tagged with an ORCID ID, like importing records from Zotero or another source?
Sheila, I'm going to throw this one to you. I know you work with people more often on this question.
Yeah. So if the work doesn't have an ORCID ID attached to it, if it does have a DOI, that's going to be really helpful, because then you can go into the ORCID record and do the search and link wizards and connect with Crossref and DataCite to find your works there. Or you can just enter a DOI. If you know what the DOI is, you can enter that and it will import some of the metadata. If you can, anywhere that you can download a BibTeX file. So for example, if your researchers have a Google Scholar profile, I know that is one of the platforms that allows you to download those citations to a BibTeX file. Then you can upload the BibTeX file into ORCID, and that will kind of help populate some of that data. So there are mechanisms, built in with those search and link wizards and the BibTeX upload. I know also, for example, Lori had mentioned North Carolina State University. When they were first getting started, they had some student workers that were helping as trusted individuals, and they would ask faculty for their CV, and then the student worker would go in as a trusted party and add those works manually, if they're dating back 20 years or whatever before there were DOIs, that kind of thing. So there are a number of different strategies for populating past works, including entering them manually. That is not, ideal, but I would also encourage people to just, even if you can't get all of the works information from the past start now in terms of considering, submitting your ORCID ID with your publication and making those connections moving forward.
And just you enter it manually that one time, it's now in your ORCID record, so now it can be shared. It's you're energizing, you're activating it that way. I'm speaking from personal experience. Some of my old things do not have a DOI, but I've manually entered. You just make a cup of coffee, you sit down, you do it, and then it makes your life easier going forward.
So we do have a few more questions. I'm going to try to handle a couple of quick ones.
Great.
And again, ones that we don't get to, we will follow up with and post responses when the slides and the recording are available. So the first one is if there's a tutorial video on how to create an ORCID account, how to maintain account information for the BioSketch and current pending support. And I would say yes. So in the slides, I referenced the April 9th NSF webinar and the upcoming May 14th one, and then also the Science CV link for the National Library of Medicine on the NIH side that have videos for all of those things. And if you can't wait for the slides to come out, if you Google Science CV, that'll be the first thing that pops up, and there are a link to short YouTube videos to talk about how to do those things. Another question about, can you link the NHLBI PMC, or I think the PubMed ID to ORCID? The answer is yes. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to add more. That was, I think, one of the first integrations that hit the research world when we all sort of knew that it was coming. There was another question about how do you convince PUI faculty, so predominantly undergraduate institution faculty, that their ORCID score won't be used against them? Or on the flip side, how do you get PUI leadership to appreciate it? I'm not sure they're referring to about a score.
I don't think I've never heard of any such thing as an ORCID score.
So they might be thinking about the H-index, which is a different thing.
Yeah,
so there's no scoring on ORCID.
Yeah. And just to the second part of that question, how do you convince faculty in general, but specifically at a primarily undergraduate institution? I think the same arguments or the same points that you would raise with any researcher, which are, this can help you save time. It's a centralized place to keep track of all of your affiliations and information. If the systems that you're interacting with are ORCID enabled, they can actually write data to your ORCID record for you, and you can send your data to those systems without having to type and fill out forms over and over again. And the extent to which those faculty are publishing and applying for grant funding, I think makes a big difference as well, because when they do have to meet those requirements from publishers and funders, that's another big motivator. Oh yeah, go ahead, Shauna. Yeah.
just when you do populate your work section in particular, maybe your funding section, it'll show your collaborations and who you're partnering with. And if you're at a predominantly undergraduate institution, it might be nice to show that you're collaborating with other institutions, just to show improve your profile and how your presence is online. Sorry, Sheila, I interrupted you.
No worries. I was just going to add that for the ORCID US community, and these resources are available to anyone online, we do have things like an outreach planning guide. So it has kind of a step-by-step walkthrough with tips and examples and resources that you can use to do this kind of outreach and education to get your researchers to use ORCID. So we have a number of resources to help with that.
Great, thanks. So I think we've got time for one more, and anything else we'll follow up on with responses when the slides and the recording is posted. And that is, are sponsors using ORCID to locate potential reviewers or to convene expert panels? I haven't heard that, but I don't know that that means it's not true.
We have spoken to some who are starting. I think there are some associations who are looking at membership, and then when somebody joins an association, they're able to write that membership to an ORCID record, and then that's also a way for the association, when they want to consider finding a panel, that they can pull the data from ORCID of their members or people who are working in certain areas, and to look through them and do an assessment that way. So it's early days, but yeah, I think we are looking at that.
Great. Thank you. And I see that we've got 1 minute left, and I think it's probably good to wrap up at this point. So I guess I'll kick it over to Mark.
Thank you, Lori, Sheila, and Shauna. As you mentioned, we will get to the questions that were not answered. We'll share with these ladies and share that information back with everyone. The webinar recording and slides will be available on our website, incura.edu/global-webinar. I'd like to thank our excellent speakers, Shauna Sadler, Sheila Rabun, and Lorianne Schultz, for this very important and informative session. We are very thankful to have you in our community. I'd also like to thank my Incura colleagues behind the scenes for this program. Lastly, please stay healthy and safe out there, everyone. This webinar was produced by Incura, the National Council of University Research Administrators. For more information on our programs and resources, visit www.ncura.edu. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.